Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 6 of Organization Theory. Let's jump right into our reminders we do weekly. This is another week of discussion forums. We've had two of the rounds of discussion forums so far. Again, I just have to say how impressed I am. There are 3 different groups, so I realize that you're not seeing all of the discussion that's going on, but all 3 of the groups have been remarkably engaged, and I've been impressed. Hopefully, you're finding that that's really a good learning tool for you, that you're learning from each other and gaining in your understanding and knowledge of the material. One thing that's a little bit different about this week is that I've been putting up 3 questions and asking you to respond to 2 of them. I do have 3 questions this week, but I'd like you to respond to all 3. And the reason for that is one of the questions is actually a mid-course evaluation. So I'm simply asking you to give me some feedback on what's going well with the class, what you like about the way the class is working within Moodle. And then also if there's any feedback you have, that things that you would like to see done differently, changed. I do that recognizing that, look at the feedback. If there are things that I can definitely implement for the next 6 weeks of the class, I will try to do that. But recognizing that there may be some things that I can't change mid-course. But that will be really valuable feedback even for me as I go forward and do this class the next time. So please do all 3 discussion forums and let me know if you have any questions about that. So our readings for this week, we have, again, 1 chapter from the Rainey book that's on formulating and achieving purpose, and really specifically about power, decision-making, and strategy within organizations. There are some chapters within the Rainey book that I haven't been thrilled with in terms of they're mostly sort of literature review and aren't really definitive about giving you some good insights. I really like this chapter. I think there's a lot of really good material there to absorb and think about and reflect back in our discussions this week. And then with the theories, we are moving into some neoclassical readings. There's an overview of neoclassical organization theory, and then some readings from Herbert Simon and Philip Selznick. I'm not going to say a lot about that in this lecture, because we will have an opportunity, like I said, in the discussion forum to engage in this material. But I guess one of the things I would say that's important to understand is that neoclassical theory is not really a theory unto itself. It is really sort of a phase where there was people that were poking some holes in classical theory. They were looking at some critiques, and it really was a transitional phase that opened up the doors for more modern theories to emerge. And so there's a nice discussion forum question, I think, that will get to that point for this week. What I thought I would do this week is really go through a case study from here at the University of Montana that I think touches on the 3 main themes in the Rainey chapter: power, decision-making, and strategy. A couple of you have probably heard me talk about this a little bit before, but I had the privilege of serving on the university's strategic planning coordinating council a couple of years ago. And what I thought I would do is just sort of walk through some of the process, some of the events that happened. I'll try to do that fairly concisely. And then at the end, maybe we can reflect a little bit on how some of those events, some of those decisions, some of the processes relate to what we're reading in Rainey. So I'll try to do that, like I said, fairly concisely. But we're going to start back in spring of 2016. President Roy Singstrom at the time decided to initiate a new strategic planning process. And just a little bit of background on sort of strategy and decision making at the University of Montana. So this process was actually it was the first time we had done a strategic planning process at the university since about 2011. There was actually a strategic plan called UM 2020 that was produced in 2012. And so we're 4 years into this plan. The president felt that there were enough changes that had happened that it was worth revisiting that. And so the other, I guess what I'd say about the existing plan at the time, it was primarily created by a small committee of mostly administrators who sat down over, I'm not sure how long period of time, but a fairly closed group that produced the strategic plan at the time. The other piece of background information I think I would share that's pertinent to this is the culture of decision making and really shared governance at the University of Montana is a very strong part of the university's culture. And by that I mean particularly there's a really strong faculty governance component to the university's culture. So what that means is for the most part a lot of decisions start with forming a committee that is comprised of representatives from various constituency groups on campus. So faculty senate nominates or names a certain number of people to sit on the committee. Staff senate does that. The student government does that. There's typically a dean, an academic dean that sits on one of those committees, and those types of things. So a lot of the decisions that get made at the university are really very political. They're done in a sort of a formal governance structure. So that's part of the background that I think is important to know here. In this first bullet point mentions that President Engstrom was interested in taking a new approach, and so he really introduced the idea of doing a strategic planning process that was outside of both of those processes that are typical, the high-level executive or administrative decision-making and the shared governance model. What he wanted to do was he actually put out a call for volunteers, people who were interested in serving on a strategic planning committee. And once he got that list of people who had volunteered, he handpicked the committee. And so that was very different than sort of turning over the control to other organizations, other constituents to make a decision about who actually gets to serve on this committee. So that was one thing that was a little bit different. When the committee first got together, this was in April of 2016, and as I said, I was fortunate enough to be one of the people that was selected to be on this committee. So one of the things that the president did at that meeting was he sort of revealed his rationale for how he chose the people that were in the room. And if you looked at the committee, it actually looked like it was representative. There were people from the faculty, there were people from staff, there were students involved, there was a vice president, there was a dean, and so on. So it very much had that same sort of structure. But I think there was a big difference in, again, who made the decisions about who those people were. And one of the things that President Engstrom told us was that his rationale for choosing the people he chose was he looked for people who had a very positive outlook on things, who had an optimistic view of where we were going. And so he really I think he sort of avoided the typical difficult people to deal with within the organization. A couple other things that happened in that first meeting. He gave the committee a great deal of discretion about approach, and specifically he said we could either take the existing strategic plan and amend it or modify it, iteratively change what was already in place, or we also had the discretion to scrap what existed and start over from scratch. So that was a fairly significant source of power that he handed over to the committee. He also allowed the committee to select its own leaders, and so this was an interesting thing. I mean, he had barely gotten that sentence out of his mouth when the vice president on the committee said, I nominate the dean who's on the committee to be the chair. And immediately somebody else seconded that, and there was immediately is there any discussion? Here's the vote. And so literally within a minute, the dean that was on the committee was named the chair. And one of the things I thought that was really interesting about that was Again, that was sort of a source of power. It was kind of the traditional higher level power, authority-wise, in the room, drove that decision. I don't, we were such a new organization that there wasn't that, or a new committee, that there wasn't that sense that, other people could sort of challenge that authority. So that's how the leadership was chosen. And then finally, the third thing I would say about the committee is that President Engstrom chose not to be a member of the committee. And in fact, he did not regularly attend meetings. He did come once or twice in the succeeding months just for some discussion and updates on our process. I'm going to go back. Sorry about that. I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of the decisions that our committee made early on. And so we did make a decision relatively early that we thought it was better to start from scratch rather than trying to amend the existing plan. We took some time to work on developing some shared values that would guide the work that we did and guide our process. And so that process, we came up with one of our values is that we were going to be highly inclusive, highly participative. And so we were going to get a lot of people involved in the process, not just the usual players. So that included people on campus, in the community, across the state, alumni, anyone who had a stake in the university. We felt it was important to include in the process. We were going to be very transparent, and so we didn't want decisions to be made behind closed doors, and so we wanted people to be able to see how the process was unfolding, and give them multiple opportunities along the way to provide feedback, give us opportunities to course correct. And so I think we held to that. The third value that we came up with was that we were going to be very much informed by data. And so we did a lot of work most of the data that we gathered was qualitative, but we did the best we could to sort of quantify that and analyze it and make sure that we were truly making decisions that reflected the information that we were gathering and the data that was out there, as opposed to more political or sort of emotional decision making. We struggled a little bit with what our process was going to look like, and eventually we sort of came across this idea that we were going to follow a sort of a design thinking model, which reflected our values. And so in design thinking, really you start with a deep empathy for all of the people who are part of the organization or who are your stakeholders. And so we did that. Then you go on to sort of define what the major challenges are, and you develop iterative approaches to addressing those. So we did, over the first 6 months or so, we ended up engaging several thousand people, I think more than 4,000 points of engagement. We did that through a variety of methods: surveys, listening sessions, one-on-one interviews, focus groups, those sorts of things. We were particularly careful, we thought, to engage sort of the traditional shared governance bodies, and in particular the faculty senate officers and the faculty union officers. And actually we had on our committee, we had the chair-elect for faculty senate, and so we also had some level of comfort that there was that channel of feedback and interaction through that person to faculty senate. So what I jumped to earlier that I didn't mean to is 6 months into our process, about the 1st of December of 2016, President Engstrom was relieved of his duties as president. And so all of a sudden our work was sort of thrown into turmoil, as well as a great deal of what was going on at the university. We sort of in that vacuum of not having a president for a short amount of time, we reached out to the Commissioner of Higher Education in Helena, and we asked him for advice. What should we do with our process? Should we suspend it? Should we continue? The advice that we got back from him was, I want you to continue on. Keep your work going. Don't let this decision deter what you've been doing. Within a short amount of time, an interim president was named, Sheila Stearns. So we then began the process of meeting with her, bringing her up to speed on our process, our progress, where we were going. That was a good thing, but she was also, taking the proverbial fire hose of information and meeting with so many people, trying to get up to speed with all of the issues that a university president deals with. And so certainly she probably was not giving this particular part of it as much attention as we would have liked her to have done. Shortly after the start of the new year, early in 2017, Dr. Stearns and the Commissioner's Office in tandem announced that there was going to be another more or less strategic process going on at the university. And this was a process of program prioritization. And so the idea was that we were going to look at every program that was offered at the university, both academic and administrative, and we were going to develop a set of evaluating criteria that would help us evaluate and sort of put all of the various programs into tiers. So high performing, medium performing, and so on. The idea being, this really is I think the Rainey book talks about it a little bit. This is a sort of a portfolio management approach to strategy. And so the idea is that you identify high value and high performing programs, and you identify the lower performing, lower value programs, and then you make some priority decisions as to where you're going to put your resources. Ideally, the idea there is that you invest more in the programs that are going to move the organization forward, and you make some really difficult decisions about perhaps stopping some of the programs that are either low performing or not as germane to the overall purpose and mission of the organization. So that was going on now simultaneously with our process. So two very different processes. One of the things that I think was the case was that this program prioritization process really was pretty high stakes, and people immediately could see that there was some security involved in that their program could potentially be on the chopping block. Their careers were potentially going to be impacted. And so a great deal of attention and emotional energy went into that. We found very much that took away from sort of the momentum that we had created in our process. All right, I'm going to go to the last bullet here. So we continued our process. We created some sort of experimental scenarios. We continued to engage campus in a variety of ways in getting feedback and iteratively moving our vision forward. So in April of 2017, we scheduled 2 open campus forums where we presented our strategic vision, again with the idea that this was not a final, it was a work in progress, and we were looking for feedback. I guess one of the pieces of feedback that we got was we actually got some really positive media coverage in the Missoulian, as you can see by this headline, Campus Praises Strategic Plan. One of the quotes in here, and I remember the faculty member saying this as part of the conversation at this forum, his comment was, "This is one of the most positive things I've seen come out of the university in many years." So a lot of the conversation was pretty positive, and it really validated, I think, for those of us who were on the committee that we took the right approach on the process, that being inclusive and being transparent, spending a great deal of time on the upfront engagement and data gathering process was a good investment in our time. But this story didn't tell all of the story. A couple of things I would point out. One of the first people who spoke at the first forum was a man who's sort of a self-appointed citizen advocate, and he immediately said that we needed to basically throw out everything we did because we violated Montana's open meeting laws throughout the process, and that nothing that we did should be allowed to go forward. And it was, and in a lot of ways he was correct. We did not follow the law in terms of, like every time we had a public meeting, you're supposed to publish the agenda broadly. You're supposed to provide opportunities for open discussion and those sorts of things. So I think one of the interesting things to think about here is that, that open meeting law really was written and designed sort of to address the traditional decision-making processes that are typically made more behind doors by smaller groups of people. And so, we felt like our process was really addressing sort of the intent of open meetings to be much more open and transparent to all of the stakeholders. And yet, that law was sort of out of sync, I think, with what we were trying to do, or we were out of sync with the law. So some disconnect there, which is interesting. The other, I think the most significant thing that happened was that the feedback that we got in the aftermath of this was really very strong from, again, the faculty governance side of campus, that constituency group, who basically pointed out to us that we were making some strategic recommendations around curriculum, and that was their sole authority to do that as faculty, that we had no authority to do that. And of course, in our thinking, we had engaged them. We had one of their members as our committee. There had never been any point along the way in our, from the person who was on our committee or in our conversations with them that they had any concerns about this. So I think we felt comfortable that, we were okay to proceed. I think what we learned in the aftermath was that, they sort of were just sitting back, not really engaging. They were just sort of letting us do our thing, knowing that they would then, at the end of the process, point out that we did not have the authority to recommend what we were recommending. So what I'd like you to do now maybe is pause the video for a little bit and just sort of reflect on the various elements of this case study, and think through what the implications are in terms of power, decision making, and strategy within a complex organization. And then I'll let you do that, and then I'll share a few ideas that I have. All right, so I'm going to assume that you've taken a little bit of time to reflect. Here's some lessons learned that I'd like to share with you. One, I think it's really critical when you're doing any sort of a strategic planning process that the chief executive is really the driver in that, and at minimum, at least intimately involved in the process all along the way, and has bought into not only the process, but sort of, the vision of what the outcomes are going to be. And especially in this case, I said when there is an interest in doing something that is really goes against the prevailing culture of the organization. And so I sort of learned this lesson from the University Strategic Planning Committee, but then I proceeded to go right into a more focused information technology strategic planning process that we did in a very similar manner. Did not have strong buy-in and participation by the chief information officer, who would have been the chief executive of that area. And so I really did not learn my lesson the first time. So second time, shame on me. Hopefully I won't do that again. But I do think, again, it's critical in an organization that you have that buy-in at the very top level, and that person is really driving the process. Two, I question whether it was wise to continue with our process at a time when there was turmoil. There was one president being let go, an interim president coming in, getting up to speed, being in that position for roughly a year, and then another process to bring in a permanent president and sort of starting that process all over again. We did consult, we had a call with the consultants to talk to him about, what should we do? He gave us some really good advice in terms of, continuing on, but making sure that we created a sort of open-ended and a vision that a new president could come in and make their own and adapt. And that really is what we did, and that really is what President Bodnar did when he came in. He took what we had done and made it his own and went his own direction with it. Obviously, I don't think it's advisable to have two really sort of competing strategic decision-making processes going on simultaneously, especially two that are very different from each other. There was a lot of fatigue in terms of people being asked to participate in these processes. And again, I think we were sort of sending mixed messages that we were doing one process over here that was very sort of forward-looking design process. Let's figure out what our problems are and solve them. And another process that was very much, let's take what we have now and figure out how to move resources around within those to enhance what we're doing. And then I think it's important to, like I said, be aware of the consequences of trying to shift power within an organization. And that goes back to this idea that we were changing who sort of had the authority and the primary power in decision making. And, that doesn't mean that you can't make those shifts, but I think we were a little bit naive to the fact that we had done what we thought we needed to do to make that shift. And in the end, we learned that we really had not. That entrenched power structures really were there in place, and they exerted themselves at the end. The one thing I would say is, when the President Bodner came in, we briefed him. His decision was to form a new strategic planning committee. It was very much more dominated by the academic side, and in particular had more dean representation, which was fine. He produced, or that committee, I should say, produced what are called priorities for action. So if you're interested in seeing what they produced, go to the university's website and just search priorities for action. It will take you to sort of the results of their strategy process. And then I guess what I would say is that even though the work that our committee that I was on did not result in what was formally adopted as a strategic plan, much of the groundwork that we laid in terms of the understanding we developed and the data that we collected was used in informing the strategy that's out there now. And I think one of the things that's gratifying is a lot of the language that I hear the president using today to talk about strategy was language that came from our committee that really was distilled from listening to people across all of the various constituents of the university and sort of distilling that and then synthesizing it into what's the big picture shared values of the university. And so those have existed. So hopefully this was a helpful process. Certainly it's something that in my mid-course evaluation in the discussion forum this week you can give me some feedback on if you want. And after this week we are halfway through the class, and so hope things are continuing to go well, and we will be back talking to you this week. Thanks.